This half hour being brought to you by Purdy Insurance. Market Street in Sunbury. Go to purdyinsurance.com. Auto, home, life, business, boat, motorcycle, RV. They do a great, great job of making sure, A, you're fully insured, the purpose of insurance. B, and the purpose of customer service is to make sure that you're also saving money wherever you can. So they'll check and see if they can get insurance over state lines. They'll maybe bundles, whatever, but they'll try and save you money and also make sure you're fully insured. That's what customer service is all about. The great people at Purdy Insurance, Market Street in Sunbury. Go to purdyinsurance.com. The book is entitled Men in White, and Chris Raymond is the author of it. Chris, thanks so much for the time. Really appreciate it as we get a chance to talk about your brilliant work.
Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate that.
So let's start with this. What did it take to organize? Because this is written in a completely different style. What did it take to organize the quotes in the order you needed them to tell the story?
It was kind of like working with a puzzle. You know, I would conduct interviews with the players and sports writers, coaches that I talked to. I think I talked to about 60 people for the book. And then have the transcripts, typed up, and I would literally go through and kind of just excise the gems, right? The quotes that I thought were most compelling. And then I found, in working with it, that they sort of started to kind of connect themselves. They fit almost like puzzle pieces because certain themes emerged in the reporting. And a lot of the players kind of returned to the similar moments or points that they were trying to make. So it was a matter of kind of stitching that together, and I found that it was a lot of fun to do. But the reason that I really kind of chose to kind of go with the oral history was just because, I had covered the team when I was there at Penn State in the 1980s, so I knew some of the people that continued to cover the team in the years after that, but the players had no idea who I was. So I felt like I needed to kind of go to them and, considering how much they'd been burned by, I think, the national media in 2011 when the story first broke, the Jerry Sandusky scandal, it was easier for me to go to them and say, like, hey, I'm trying to tell this story, and it's really going to come out in your own words.
Did it take more work with a few of the guys than others because of the trust?
I was really surprised. I had much more luck than I thought. There were some players that really never quite warmed up to it and didn't speak to me in the end. But I kind of started with like some of the walk-ons and some of the role players, and I think those interviews went well, and I think those guys kind of talked to some of the other players. And then I got lucky. I was able to get to Trace McSorley and Christian Hackenberg fairly early in the process, and I think by the time those interviews were done, others were kind of willing to speak to me.
There is a narrative about all of this, as we both know. What did you learn through all of this that maybe you did not know before?
For me, I knew a really good story in that 2012 season, and I knew there was a great story in that 2016 season. It was a matter of, can you connect the dots, right, and lead people through those kind of lean years. And I wasn't sure whether there was going to be enough of a story there, and what I found was that there was. I mean, those guys were committed all the way through, and it was kind of like a roller coaster ride. So you did get certain breakthrough games, the 4-overtime win against Michigan, and then you would kind of plummet to, the loss to Temple in 2015. But there were things that they were sort of trying to do. I think the thing that really came through for me was, and I guess you kind of expect this from a Penn State player, but that whole idea about, Paterno's idea about success with honor, high character guys, really that's what they kept leaning on in those lean times, was that, these were guys that were coming here not just to win football games, but because they wanted to kind of be well-rounded individuals, and because they felt that whole idea about like winning with honor, about winning on a team where you're surrounded by high character guys matters. And so it became a little bit more about the mission. So that was really nice to see that idea reinforced, I think. I wasn't sure whether I was going to get that going in, but I definitely had that. It was very clear in the interviews that I conducted with the players how thoughtful they were, and how much that whole idea about kind of playing with those high character guys mattered to them.
Well, as somebody who covered the team before in the 80s and got to know the players in that era, Did you find a lot of similarities between the players of that era and the players of this era that you talked to? What were any differences maybe you encountered?
I think that it really was. They were all. I mean, I remember seeing that transition when I was there from like my freshman year and those guys that came in as freshmen to the ones that graduated with me in 1987, and just how sharp and thoughtful they were. And I got that same thing from the players that I spoke to from today. I think one of the things that I found was really interesting in talking to Lydell Sargent, who had played years before, but had come back to talk to the players when it looked like everything was going to fall apart in 2012. And one of the things that he drove home to me, it's kind of obvious, but I haven't thought about it this way, but because Joe Paterno was there for 50 years, you had Letterman for 50 years who all went through the same exact experience. And that's really unusual for a college football program to have that. And so those guys all bonded because they had all been through the same thing. And when it impacted their lives, they went back and, talked to their own children. I think that's why you saw guys like Mauti and Zordich kind of step forward to kind of lead this rebirth, because those guys knew very well what Penn State represented and the impact it had on your later life. And so they were willing to kind of step forward and say, hey, there's something important here. We need to rescue this, right? We're not going to let one man tear this program down.
In fact, it's interesting because today James Franklin was talking about Malik Golden, and Malik Golden has started a restaurant in Connecticut. And he was like the core values at the time, because Malik Golden is one of those guys who was brought in by Joe Paterno, played for Bill O'Brien, and then played for James Franklin. Right? So he encompassed all of it, and it's interesting how all three ended up having an impact on him in his life in their own way, with Penn State being the common denominator.
That's right. And I really think that's what those guys kind of dialed into. I think the university, the administration, the board of trustees had a very difficult time, defending the university when the scandal first broke. But what these guys tapped into was that idea about success with honor, right? They had lived it, day in and day out. And so that's what they kind of turned to when they were trying to figure out, like, what guides us through this. And that's really is what they kind of leaned on in the lean times. It's what they celebrated when they won. And I think that's what kind of brought the program back in what is a remarkable span of time, right? Nobody expected them to be back in the Big Ten championship 5 years after the sanctions were handed down. And yet they managed to kind of pull that off. And it was from that. I think you saw Bill O'Brien, the thing that he held up to these guys is like, you're not going to be able to play in a bowl game, but you're going to play in front of 100,000 fans every Saturday, number one. But number two, you're going to get a world-class education here. I mean, that's right out of Joe Paterno's playbook. And I think you see the same thing with James Franklin today. He's talking about, molding these guys not into just great football players, but into, smart, well-rounded men, right?
Mark Emmert, who still can't find the $100 million from his UConn experience, wanted this place gutted because he wanted to show the world, his power and what it meant, and that Penn State would be playing in front of 25,000, 30,000. When you talk to everybody, what did the fan support mean to them, that it was there on an every game basis?
Yeah, I think that was huge. I think those players, when you turn the corner from 2011, you have Bill O'Brien come in, they have a really great winter workout, and I think they've pulled together and they think they weathered the storm, and then those sanctions get handed down, and worse than the sanctions was, the decision to absolve them of all ties to the university, which meant that you had recruiters come rushing in, trying to tear the team apart, right? You're looking across the table from you and saying, like, is there going to be an offensive line for me? Is there going to be a quarterback there for me? Those guys that even wanted to stay weren't sure whether the program was still going to be there. And the fact that the fans, rallied. There was a rally days after those sanctions came out at a practice at like 6 o'clock in the morning, and thousands of people showed up for that. And that really struck the players hard. There was a pep rally the day before that first game in 2012. And then you just had fans that kind of came out en masse for the whiteouts and the games going forward. And I think it was very clear to those players that, maybe they weren't getting the support from from the NCAA and from others, but Penn State fans were undeterred in their support for it. And I think a lot of that was just because those guys were stand-up. I look at it. My son was young, in his early teens when all of this was happening. And, in writing the book, I kind of reflected and I was like, you couldn't have asked for better role models, right, than guys like Michael Mauti and Michael Zordich and Matt McGloin and Christian Hackenberg and Trace McSorley, Saquon Barkley. It really is. There's a sense of a certain kismet there that those are the guys that ended up on the team. But, not only were they great on the football field, like I said, but, guys like Saquon would kind of sit there and sign autographs for, as many fans as wanted to kind of stay and collect them at the end of games. They were all so thoughtful, so well-spoken. They really worked hard in the locker room. It's really... These days, it's really kind of difficult when you have a child to kind of say, like, hey, look up to sports heroes, right? But those guys were certainly there on that team. To this day, you can kind of look up to what they achieved.
If there was anybody in that time that was symbolic that still to this day creates a bit ire among Penn State fans, it's Silas Redd. And Silas Redd ended up, and Lane Kiffin was the coach at the time, went to USC. I know I've talked to enough guys, and I feel strongly this way. I wish he'd come back to Penn State because I know why. Like, he was so attached to Joe. He was devastated by the fact that Joe wasn't there. And what were the comments that you received about Silas Redd? Because I know in talking to the players I've talked with, they'd love to bring him back. And look, and I'd stand side by side with him myself.
Yeah. I think, when I was in the midst of reporting the book, that's when that documentary, Saving the Roar, came out. Yep. And that certainly was one of the bigger storylines there. I think one of the most remarkable moments in that documentary is when they went back and talked to Silas Redd about the experience and how much it gutted him. You had a guy there in tears. He was literally in tears at the end of that interview.
I know.
You saw the impact that it had on him. And I think he spoke then, not long after that, on Adam Brenneman's podcast. And again, just a remarkable interview. And so when I saw those two things, I knew that had to be a moment in the book where you kind of heard from him and what he went through. So I've heard players on those podcasts. I've heard others kind of talk about wanting Silas Redd to come back. But I really do think it's like somebody needs to step forward and make that happen, because I think Silas Redd would really appreciate that, would love that, to be reunited with that group. And I feel like you get the same sentiment on the Penn State side. A lot of those guys kind of look at what he went through and look back to what he meant to that 2011 team. Like, nobody faults him for going to USC.
Right.
He is that guy that looked and said, is there going to be an offensive line? And here's a team that's ready to compete for a national title. And he was like right on the cusp of going into the NFL draft, right, being a high draft pick. So nobody faults him for that.
No, and that's the thing. I'd stand side by side with him anytime, tell everybody, hey, look, I know the reasons why he went, and the reasons you talked about, and again, he had a real attachment to Joe. All right? And so there's a lot going on there. I've always felt, Chris, that with the fan base, there was an us versus the world mentality from the moment this happened until the Ohio State game in 2016, where I've said that when that game ended, the moment Grant Haley crossed the goal line, that to me was the first true release of joy and not just us against the world, that there was a release of joy that night that got the program emotionally into a different level. What was your thought on that?
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I think that I think what people on the outside didn't realize in 2011 was that you had the national media sort of descending on the campus. And pushing, the story forward, driving it forward, like really pushing for heads to roll. I know for me personally and a lot of my alumni friends, like they wanted answers to who knew what and when, on campus. And it just became clear that was never going to happen. You were never going to get those answers because of how fast they pushed that story forward. And so I think that's where that us versus them mentality comes from. It was like an invading army, really, that's where that us versus them mentality comes from. But that 2016 team, when you look at it, that, was one of the most thrilling teams to watch because they had all those sort of come from behind victories. And again, you're rooting for guys like Trace McSorley and Grant Haley and Saquon Barkley. It's hard not to root for those guys. I think you couldn't look for better ambassadors for the sport of college football. And so I think when they finally broke through, it was clear that, the team was back. This was a team that could compete on the national stage. And they did it in a way that was so joyous, right? Such a thrilling win. Topped only maybe by the one in the Big Ten championship where they come from like 21 points down, right?
Right.
So I think that it was hard. It was easy then for the rest of the world to kind of come in and celebrate it, right? And to kind of forget what had happened 5 years later, or at least, forgive what happened, 5 years earlier.
Chris, I'll use an old-time word here to ask the question. How big did the Rolodex get for this?
It's funny. I have a lot of friends. I actually was able to reach out to a lot of the players on LinkedIn because what people don't realize is their football careers are over for a lot of them. They're off doing other things. So I can say that my LinkedIn followers got significantly larger as a result of it. But again, it was I think I was doing these interviews in the midst of the pandemic and, working full time at Consumer Reports where I worked during the day. So to come, close the laptop at the end of the day and interview one of these players, it ended up being like crazy inspiring for me. And that's why I was able to kind of do it night after night. So, they're all good guys, like I said, and I'm just really honored that they trusted me to tell their story, and that I was able to kind of pull it off. And as you see when you read the book, it's really, I didn't have to add any drama to it. I didn't have to go for any salacious details here. There was a great dramatic story that was waiting there to be told, and I'm fortunate those guys shared it with me.
Here it is 12 years later, book's now out. How gratified have you been by the reaction to the book?
Yeah, it's been tremendous, I think, so far. I mean, I've had a few players that kind of reached out to me and said, you got it. Thank you. I really appreciate it. But there's also been, I've done signings in Harrisburg and Williamsport and Scranton and State College, and I had fans that came forward too. And that was also one of the goals was just to try to explain what it means to be a Penn State fan, what it meant to kind of go through that turmoil to people who maybe didn't understand it all that well. And so for me, it's just been tremendously gratifying to have, those fans, people who've read it, kind of come forward and said, thank you for telling this story.
What has been your family's reaction to it?
I think they were happy when I got to talk to other people about it. They heard about it for 3 years as I reported. So they're happy that it's done and that I'm talking to you instead of them.
Fair enough. Chris, it's outstanding. I couldn't put it down. I went wire to wire with it, and I appreciate the tremendous effort that you put in to tell the story exactly right.
Well, thank you, Steve. That means an awful lot coming from you as somebody who's watched the program up close.
Chris, thank you. Appreciate
for so many years.
Hey, really, good luck with this. It's entitled Men in White. Quickly, Chris, where can people now pick it up? How can they get it either online or in a bookstore?
Yeah, it's in bookstores from coast to coast. So you can go to either brick and mortar stores or it's available online as well. Anywhere where you buy books, you're likely to find it.
Well, congratulations on this great work, and we appreciate the time you gave us tonight.
Thank you. Take care.
Chris Raymond. He wrote the book Men in White. It is an outstanding piece of work, well worth your time. It is a terrific read. This half hour brought to you by Purdy Insurance, Market Street in Sunbury. Go to purdyinsurance.com as we continue on News Radio 1070 WKOK. This half hour of the show being brought to you by Purdy Insurance, Market Street in Sunbury. Go to purdyinsurance.com. Auto, home, life, business, boat, motorcycle, RV. They do a great job of making sure that you are fully insured while saving you money. So important. Always looking forward to saving you money. And customer service means everything to them. At Purdy Insurance, Market Street in Sunbury, go to purdyinsurance.com. Always great to be joined by the brilliant and insightful Mark Wogenrich, whom I have such great respect for. My friend, welcome back to the show. It's great to have you with us.
As always, appreciate being here. Thanks, Steve.
All right. Mark, Saturday, I referred to it on the broadcast at the end with Jack as I felt like it was a workmanlike performance. How would you describe it?
Good word. I don't think it was... a lot of these times when I'm writing, maybe I'll try to think of, like, scores in terms of functionality. Like, in my mind, I call them functional scores. To me, this was the functional score of 27-3. That was a late drive that UCLA had scored in the last minute, largely against second-team defense. It matters on the board, but if you're looking at just good on good, I felt like 27-3 was probably a fairly representative score of a result of what happened that day, and maybe it didn't feel as though that score was represented that kind of dominance, and they didn't have it to an extent. But there was it was just another one of those games. It didn't feel like it was in doubt. I didn't feel like in any of these 5 games so far, close as they may be, to the point where against Bowling Green, they're still have to recover an onside kick, but the result didn't appear in doubt. That it was just a degree of the result, and part of me thinks that that's just what Penn State kind of is facing this season. That it's just they're kind of being graded on degrees.
But I mean, let's face it, because of the playoff, that's probably how they're how everybody's being evaluated at this point. Because one thing we don't know is we don't know what the committee thinks because they haven't done this before.
Right, exactly, and it goes to an interesting point that James Franklin brought up. I found it interesting. He mentioned it after Saturday's game, and then mentioned it again today, that Penn State is the only team over the last 4 years. They were the only team over the last 4 years to start a season 4-0, and now they're the only team over the last 4 years to start a season 5-0. And that there's a lot of subtext to that, and you get into like scheduling and everything like that. But that means that for 4 years now, they're putting themselves in position. That every year they're getting themselves into position to be competitive. This season, they don't have to be, it's just strange to call it as competitive, but they have a wider berth this season that, as you said, with 12 teams and with the playoff committee that you really just haven't any idea what they're thinking as of now, and you won't for still a couple of weeks. It's important to put yourself in a 5-0 position and to be there, but I don't think you have to be. You just don't have to be superhuman, as maybe you did in past years, and that style meant as much. It certainly means something, but it doesn't. Not going to mean as much. We don't know what they were thinking. I think the best example. We don't know what they're thinking of Alabama right now.
Right.
Leading Georgia 28-0, hanging on, and then losing at Vanderbilt. We have no idea what their perception of Alabama is, and it's probably a good thing that we really don't know and won't know for a couple of weeks until these perceptions gather more data.
No question. And I think when you look at Saturday, Vanderbilt beats Alabama. Alabama never led. First time in 5 years. Right? Washington beat Michigan. Minnesota beat USC. Arkansas beat Tennessee. It's hard to win. I mean, you got games like that. It's hard to win.
And it's even harder. I looked. It's even harder to win now. At least early, it's showing. It's harder to win when you have to go somewhere and cross a couple of time zones, whether the weather travel affects you or not, at least early in some of these games, it has mattered. I mean, I think I have right now. It's like the team that's done the traveling in these Big Ten games. It's either crossed a couple of time zones, or in either direction. I think they're like 1-9, 1-8, or 1-9, something like that. The only team that's won crossing a couple of time zones is Indiana and UCLA.
Right.
So there is something there. That one, it's just hard to win, and two, it's hard to win when you're playing. When you've got to divert, when you've got to adjust your schedule so much and make make scheduling concessions. So that to me is one of the unique factors in play with Penn State going to USC. That we think in terms of the only time we travel like that is we think in terms of that being a bowl game, and there's a lot more built into it. And now it's how do they handle the fact that they're only going for 3 days instead of 5 or 6.
Through the opening 5 games, is there any area that's been a little better than you thought it might be? And is there an area where they're not quite as good as you thought they might be?
I probably would go with conventional wisdom. That they're better at wide receiver than I thought they would be. I thought there would be more of a hierarchy with Trey Wallace as being a defined absolute number one, and then complementary receivers around him. And that may still turn out to be the case over the course of 12 games and beyond. But the fact that you've got 4 players, 3 receivers and Tyler Warren with 100-yard receiving games, and the fact that that Liam Clifford can have like the third down production that he's had this year, and specifically the third down production he had against UCLA. I see them being able, at that position, with those 4 guys, it just seems like they got a nice 4-player rotation there with Wallace, Liam Clifford, Julian Fleming, and Amari Evans, that at some point, and you don't necessarily know when it's coming, at some point one of those guys can kind of go off and have a big game. I think that's been a real factor. That's been a real positive for me. And special teams, it's part of it is also a circumstance with having to play, Caden Saunders for a few weeks in a limited status as punt return, so he kind of gave up that element in order to catch the pass or in order to catch punts and just make sure you have possession. But there's just been a little bit of shakiness on special teams. Like Riley Thompson didn't have his best game punting the ball. Gabe Nwosu's kicked a couple out of bounds, and then the changes at kicker. I just think that I always say, you don't notice special teams until you notice them. You don't notice kickers until you notice them. I think those are the grace notes that will show up in bigger games.
You mentioned the receivers. What I've found interesting is Penn State has had 4 100-yard receiving games from 4 different players.
Right, exactly. That's what I was trying to get at with more words than you did. That's been very like I expected it from Tyler Warren. Sure. It's hard. Sometimes it's just hard for tight ends to get 100-yard receiving games because you don't expect them with as much of the yards after catch as a receiver, and you're not going to throw the 50-yarder to those guys. But he's just so effective and such a weapon in so many ways. But you don't necessarily expect, unless it's late receiving yards in third quarter, late third quarter or fourth quarter, when you might be piling up yardage, or if you're giving chase, and they haven't had to do that yet. But you don't expect that many receivers to have that kind of game unless you're throwing 45 times a game. That's the other thing. That Drew's just not in this offense. He hasn't been a 45 pass guy a game. I mean, he's averaging in the 20s. I don't have the number in front of me, but he's just not throwing a ton of passes. So to have 3 different guys with 100-yard games, I think speaks to the explosivity, one, of their passing offense, and 2, like I said, the fact that each of those guys brings just something a little bit unique that in a certain situation can be explosive at just the right time.
Which then brings us to the defense. And when I look at, you want to be good up the middle. Right? And you look at Zane Durant Thomas, you look at Kobe King, you look at Jalen Reed. Quarterbacks you and I both know, Mark, and all the quarterbacks you and I have talked to over the years, they don't like pressure in their face.
Right.
What has Durant meant in that regard, and then what's been the domino effect of Durant on what he's doing to help the defensive ends?
I remember talking to Zane like that about last year, and him saying that his size, I mean, he's gotten bigger, but initially he wasn't that big a guy, but he never thought that was an issue because he's explosive. And he's almost got like a defensive end kind of step coming out of a 3-point stance. And I think he's really shown that this year. And just to have him to be able to consistently get through and at least get a hand up, get an arm up, make a quarterback move, get him out, or at least, force them to be rolling quarterbacks so then he's only using half the field. When you do that, and then you're lining Abdul Carter up behind him situationally, which just adds another element to that up the middle, that up the middle scene that they've got going on. Then with I think Kobe King's having a terrific year so far. He's been very good, very sure, and Jalen, even without KJ Winston, man, if you had Reed, Wheatley, and still had those three guys, Reed, Wheatley, and Winston back there, you'd have an all-star class of the baseball, pitcher, shortstop, center fielder. It would be a masterclass with that group. But even without Winston, they've still been able to get Jalen Reed in some of those blitz packages going. He had a big one at the goal line against UCLA. And I've just been really impressed, specifically with those two guys, with King and Durant, as far as how they can then manifest plays for Tony Rojas and deny Dennis Sutton. And like I said, Reed being able to come off and blitz, stuff like that. And the corners will feed off that too, that they can jump around. I think Zane Durant has been probably about as core player as they've had defensively so far, and be able to have ripple effects that just improves conditions for everybody else.
I'm going to guess that when they put all this together, and USC and UCLA said, "Hey, is there an avenue for us to get in?" And Fox then said, "We'll make a call," and found out it was a possibility. And then a year later, Oregon and Washington got it. Something tells me this is what the Big Ten had in mind Saturday, a doubleheader of Penn State, USC, followed by Ohio State, Oregon. I think, Mark, this is probably what they were hoping for.
Yeah, I mean, that's the centrifuge of that. Yeah, absolutely. This is the centrifuge of that, of the whole expansion. And I think one of the really interesting ripple effects of that expansion then comes into play with a team like Indiana.
Yes.
Because, as you said, the networks, the three media rights partners want Penn State, USC. They want Oregon, Ohio State. They want Michigan, USC. They want Washington, Ohio State. They want the brand games. Are they okay then with having, again, not disrespecting Indiana, but they okay with having a team like Indiana or Rutgers play the noon Big Ten Network game or the FS1 game, and maybe won't place them into higher profile matchups? Some of the teams that Rutgers doesn't play, some of the teams Indiana doesn't play or hasn't played yet. It's going to help those teams too, really, because Indiana's 6-0. And their schedule's going to get their schedule's going to toughen, but they're not getting certain teams. Rutgers is not getting certain teams. I think Penn State, Ohio State, and Michigan are off Rutgers' schedule, if I'm correct. I don't have it in front of me. But I'm wondering how they're going to have to reevaluate scheduling in a couple of years if that brings into play, like you said, like in Indiana, going 10-2 and getting into the Big Ten title game, perhaps. I don't know if that's going to be feasible, but that to me is going to be an interesting byproduct of having the monster games as well in your prime windows.
Exactly. All right. What's your thought on this game this week? USC's coming off the tough loss to Minnesota. Do I think the replay guys in the end got it right? Yes, but their methodology was awful. If you could tell me where the ball is, I mean, please. That's an entirely different subject, which maybe I'll touch on in a moment. But what's just your thought on USC and what they bring to the table for Lincoln Riley?
I was driving back from Penn State, so I was listening to that game, and I had the Minnesota radio crew on, and they were bamboozled. One, at the decision. They sounded a little bit perplexed by PJ Fleck's decision to go for it, but two, they were, as you were saying, they were surprised at the methodology and their view of that play. Just they seemed to be absolutely certain that he was in even before the review. Mm-hmm. So if you're Lincoln Riley watching that and you feel like you're that close to getting it, kind of escaping, and then you get the interception in the end zone, then you feel like you're that close to escaping your own cue. How does that reframe and reset where you are? And coming back home, sometimes that kind of thing is good. That kind of reset, that kind of team reset can make them edgy. And Penn State walks into something like that, a defense that gave up 2 late touchdowns, and now they have some soul searching to do on that angle this week. And how do they respond to that? I think they're gonna, that's a point scoring offense too, but with Penn State, which if they can get under pressure and the coverage, I feel like the matchup is. I feel like there's a lot in going in Penn State's direction regarding the matchup. Now, all the other forces that are coming into it, like number of possessions and just having to play out there and getting out there, just being ready for that kind of regular season game as opposed to a bowl game. I think that all definitely factors into it. But I do, initially, I do kind of like the matchup as a lean, leaning in Penn State's direction. It's offense, especially offense versus defense.
I want to ask you about the replay reviews for a moment. Virginia Tech Miami ends. It's called a touchdown. Then on review, they reverse it. Okay. Then I watch Minnesota USC. They mark him short of the goal line. They reverse it. I watched the quarterback for Cal scramble out, the Miami kid, and he's not trying to hurt him, but he does launch himself and hits him square in the helmet with his helmet. In each case, I thought you needed indisputable video evidence to overturn a call on the field. Now, do I think they got the Miami and the Minnesota calls in the end correct? Yes, but I can't see it. Okay, I'm watching them like I can't see it. And the Miami thing's the most obvious targeting thing in the world. No, like what am I missing? Am I missing something, Mark?
No, and I mean I can extend that to baseball. Being a Yankees fan, again, I didn't see the game, but the Jazz Chisholm steal of second base that he ended up scoring, that was eventually the winning run, and it sure looked like he didn't get there. That it did look like it did look like that there was a sliver of air between him and the bag. Right. So I'm ready to, I'll acknowledge that one too as a New York Yankees fan. I don't know whether they're feeling like replay has to be some sort of court decision.
Right.
That if they're getting to if they get to the indisputable part, that there's some sort of appeal that's going to happen. That if they don't, that if they're wrong, then an appellate court comes into play. So that's where I think maybe some of these things are hedging, potentially that way. I'm not, I can't speak to the mind of a replay official,
course, yeah.
But it almost seems to me like they're a judge ruling with an appellate court in mind when none is there, and ultimately that might impact the way they're going with the indisputable evidence concept that you're talking about.
Yeah, because I couldn't find it on any of those, but that's
right.
It's like, okay. Mark, always a pleasure. Thanks so much for the time you gave us today and the great insight.
Yeah, outstanding. Appreciate it. Thanks, Steve.
Mark Wogenrich, always great to talk with him. This half hour brought to you by Purdy Insurance. Market Street in Sunbury. Go to purdyinsurance.com. Great to have you with us today here on News Radio 1070 WKOK.